Welcome. This is Hugh Massey, again from DNA Behaviour. In this session, I'm delighted to take you through our business DNA natural behaviour discovery and in particular the comparison report. In this session, in the comparison report, I'm going to work on the comparison of Chris Coddington and Helen Jones. And for notional discussion purposes, Chris is the leader, and Helen is the employee or teammate. The reason I like comparison reports is that they put straight out there for you the comparison between two people. You can see their scores, you can see their similarities and their differences. We often talk about how differences can divide, but also differences can be an asset. Similarities usually mean a shared perspective, but at points then as well, there can be a clash. If you've got two strong initiators, for example, working together, they each need to have a territory that they can sort of own and control and direct, or there needs to be very clear boundaries set. So, you know, understanding the similarities and understanding the differences is important. I think one of the greatest challenges for a leader is to work with the differences and to harness them and bring them together so that they do become an asset. You know, there's lots of leadership philosophies out there, but most leaders fail because they don't deal with the differences. And similar is true in many settings, including families. So in the report, we follow a lot of the same methodologies that I've already talked about in other of our business DNA report feedback sessions that I've been doing. We're looking for each individual's strongest two traits. So we start out here for Chris being the leader. He's pioneering, which means he's very goal-driven, and then he's skeptical, which means that he's going to ask a lot of questions, be guarded, be wary. This is sort of the other side of trust. In other words, he won't be as trusting. So, you know, but we do look at skeptical as being a strength because he's probably discerning. But again, in a relationship, he may not breed trust because of some of those behaviors that are there. And then you take Helen, who to some degree is opposite, and we'll see more of that in a minute. We start to see that she is very outgoing and quite creative. So she likes the new ideas, wants to talk a lot, wants to explore possibilities. So thinking about it, you can see here in the graphic that they're quite different, and this is what needs to be harnessed. And again, with those different talents, if brought together and harnessed, great asset, but otherwise it could be quite divisive. So we can see Chris with who's in the lighter green here, but the bold line. He's much more take charge than Helen. A T score of 69 is extremely strong. 42 on cooperative is quite strong in its own right, but we're talking here a 27-point difference in the score. So, you know, what I would look for is any differences in the scores of more than 10 points, which is more than one standard deviation, will tend to be quite a lot. The difference will start to show up. So here it's nearly 3 standard deviations. That's a lot. So that's a very big difference in behavior. The outgoing versus reserved is enormous. And, you know, one of the things that you see that happens when someone is extremely outgoing, like Helen, she want to talk a lot, be very enthusiastic. There'll be quite a lot of energy that comes with that. And for someone that's more reserved, who likes to retreat and be by themselves, they could find that overwhelming and withdraw. And the more that Helen talks, the more Chris might withdraw. And she might find it very hard to get engagement out of him. And therefore, trust can get lost on that. As a leader, it's up to Chris to step out of himself a bit more and be prepared to have that, have conversations and not be withdrawn. But you can see where when these gaps are big, that's an area that would need to be worked on. This is an area they would need to work on to build their relationship. They'd need to set boundaries and guardrails around that. And that's partly what this report is designed to help do. They're both relatively fast-paced, so they can be quite rational, have quick discussions. So that's a shared similarity. It should be okay. But the shared blind spot might be that they're not patient enough for building relationships. Spontaneous versus planned, there's roughly a 20-point gap here. So again, that's a difference that needs to be worked on. And then, as I mentioned before, Chris is quite skeptical. Helen is moderately trusting. So Chris would need to watch his skepticism with her, and that it doesn't get too dominant, be too discerning, be questioning absolutely everything to the nth degree. He's got to give her some freedom, otherwise this gets lost. But the relationship gets lost. But at the same time, Helen needs to tighten it up, learn to tighten it up a little bit, and keep a focus. So this works on both sides. But what I'm bringing out is the differences here. The graphic shows it. Another area where this report is very useful is in onboarding somebody into a company. To show them how different they are to their manager, for the manager or the leader and the person coming into the company to have these conversations up front. To see each other a little bit more in the raw, as it were, in terms of behavior, and talk about that and see where again, that adaptation is going to be needed, also to help in setting expectations. So in that area here, we would find that Chris is going to be quite goal-driven. He's going to want to hold Helen accountable for what she commits to as in respect of completing her part of the business plan. And so I can see that could be some tension if she doesn't want to push herself hard enough, and him being very driven. He's got to respect her somewhat desire for a balanced life, keeping things more steady and stable. Chris is a bit more of a risk taker there, and then the creativity. She's far more creative, and she will be bringing Chris quite a lot of ideas at times. He might find that overwhelming and dismiss some of them because he's more anchored or just doesn't want to brainstorm. Again, that could be a loss of trust point. So we can see that with these two individuals, being Chris and Helen, they're quite different. They're strong in their own right. Chris probably would be, being more take charge, would be a more dominant person, but you would definitely hear Helen. And again, just recognizing the differences and the two of them working on them would be very important. But if they can manage that, then there's a great formula for success between the two of them. And then if we come down into this part of the report, working with their two strongest factors. So for Chris being pioneering and skeptical, we can get more insights about them. Again, this is an area where Helen could start to learn a little bit more about Chris. And then as we go down to the next table on the reverse, Chris learned a little bit more about Helen. They can ask each other questions from this. You as a facilitator, if need be, could ask questions as well, to draw out the differences and see how they play themselves out. And we do the same with the workplace insights here. So we can see that, Chris is very results and goals driven, not as relational, whereas Helen's more onto the relationship side, more into innovation, but she will communicate, can make decisions. So, she's a different person, which we've been talking about. It's up to Chris as the leader, who's more introverted or reserved, not to withdraw with someone like Helen. He's got to engage her. And then here we've got the cues, which is, I think, the important part of the report on how they need to work with each other and modify their style so that they can engage with each other and build that relationship. And then we can see who they're going to work more easily with in a team setting. they will work more easily with different people because they themselves are different and in some ways relatively opposite. I find the performance guides here to be one of the most useful tools, so that each can see their performance strengths and struggles. So there's 5 strengths, 3 struggles, and 5 performance environment keys. I think this helps pinpoint, the inherent talents. So here are the inherent talents of Chris, but here comes his struggles. It's good certainly for Chris to be aware of his own, but also for Helen to be aware of them as well, and to know how to leverage them, and also here for her to know how to communicate with Chris. So presenting things logically, the right amount of information at the right time would be important. Playing into his need to hear about action and goals. And then on the other side, then here's the performance guide for Helen. So Chris needs to understand this and to be able to communicate with her on her terms, spend time in the relationship, tell her who's involved, be enthusiastic, allow her to brainstorm. Otherwise, you shut her down. And then the back here, we get into the strength, the sub-factors more, and you can see there's similarities and differences here. And that might also provide some more pinpointing of areas that they need to work on to unlock the greatness in their relationship. So there are a lot of differences again here, and you'd be looking for those over 10 points, of which there are many, starting off with the biggest gaps, so that you can see where to start and ask questions. So also in the business DNA system, we have a 1-page talent DNA comparison report. So I've got it here for Chris and Helen. And this just distills everything down that I've been talking about so far, from the more detailed report to a 1-page report with 10 items, the key ones. And you can automatically see the differences. And I think this sort of gives the game away a little bit, which is good, very quickly, about how they operate. So we can see immediately, just in these 10 key areas, how different Chris and Helen are, and this shows you the areas they've got to work on, from the desire to make decisions. So Chris has got a very strong desire to make decisions. Helen's going to be, as the more cooperative person, as more of the follower. She might underestimate herself, and so you can see that gap there. So it's important that Chris, to some degree, invites her into the decision-making process. That would be one way of looking at that. Includes her, keeps her confidence up. He's very results-focused, whereas she might be potentially looser, not have as many boundaries naturally that she sets for herself in her work, so might need a bit more guidance. Her strength is that she's more instinctively intuitive, which is needed in certain situations, more flexible, but may not be as pinpointed on the bottom line. He's very goal-orientated. She's more content with where she's at. So in a workplace setting, might need more focusing on goals. But again, Chris's scores are very strong here, and he could over-dominate her. He could over-dominate her in a lot of areas. Also, it's important to recognize these scores are not the T-score that we've been using in the other reports. This is the population percentage scores. So 96 is 96% of the population that Chris is stronger than in terms of the desire to make decisions. On the other side, Helen might underestimate herself 92% more than others. And then we come down here. Helen is extremely innovative. So that's where she's strong there with 90. And down here, the gaps are less great, around direct communication. Helen's more relational than Chris. Chris could be more focused on what he needs to do and get done. And this report is pitched around performance, success factors and performance impediments. So it's got a different tenor to some degree than the mainline comparison report that I showed you previously in this session. So it's good to look at both of them and again, ask questions. But, again, the main point is to get a very quick sighting on the differences between the two people.